Hey guys, Jason here. So today I wanted to talk about shutter speed, specifically if you're filming in slow motion. So the general rule for shutter speed is the 180-degree shutter rule, which basically just means that whatever your frame rate is, your shutter speed is double that. So if your frame rate is 24 frames per second, cinematic look, your shutter speed should be 48 or whatever is the closest you can get to it with your camera, mine being 50. If you were filming in 60 frames per second, then theoretically your shutter speed should be 120. However, there are instances where you can break this rule. You just need to know what your image is going to look like if you do break it. There are certainly certain situations where you might find yourself wanting to break this rule. For example, so let's say you're filming a real estate video. You're shooting in 60 frames per second as you're moving through the house just because you want to help smooth out your footage as much as you possibly can. So you're filming in 60 frames per second. The lighting isn't very good and you already have your ISO up really about as much as you want to go before you start introducing too much noise into your footage. So your only option in that situation really is to drop your shutter speed down to say 60. Lowering your shutter speed is going to introduce more motion blur because your shutter is open for longer, so it's capturing the image for longer. However, if you're only shooting something like a real estate video and nothing is really moving in the image except your camera, then lowering your shutter speed can actually work because nothing is moving, so there's nothing really to cause excessive motion blur that's going to look ugly or distracting to the viewer. The only thing that's moving is your camera. So if you're lowering your shutter speed, just keep that in mind and you'll have to move even more carefully and deliberately with your camera and not introduce too much shaky cam. You want to keep it as stable as possible to minimize whatever extra motion blur you're adding into your footage. Now consequently, the opposite is also true. If you raise your shutter speed up to 500, 1000, whatever the case may be, then there will be less motion blur in your shot. So this may come in really handy if you're shooting something like a sporting event. You may actually want less motion blur in your footage to just get that cleaner, crisper final shot. So a real life situation where this may come in handy, let's say you're filming a wedding. It's immediately after the ceremony, the bride and groom are walking away, everyone's clapping, and you want to capture that moment where they're walking with a really shallow depth of field. You want to focus just on the bride and the groom. So you're not willing to sacrifice your shallow depth of field for this shot, but you don't have an ND filter with you. It's a super bright sunny day, you have your ISO down to 100 or 200, and if you're not willing to sacrifice the shallow depth of field, the only other thing you can do is raise up your shutter speed if you don't have an ND filter. So instead of filming that moment with 120 shutter speed, maybe you want 500 or 1000 to get your exposure correct. In that situation, you're gonna have far less motion blur, but it actually will look really nice for a wedding. You'll capture a bride and groom in a really crisp slow motion moment, which they may actually prefer. So that is everything for today. Just a super quick overview on shutter speeds when you're filming in slow motion and a couple things for you guys to keep in mind. I'll see you next time.